Senate will come to order. The chaplain will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Everlasting God, keep our lawmakers in your holy hands. Empower them to heed your instructions as they remember that your admonition provides light for their journey. Let your gentleness motivate our senators to respect one another and to guard their lips. Lord, give them the gift of your peace that provides joy even during life storms. Use them as instruments for righteousness in a sinful world. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., January 13th, 2020. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Josh Hawley, a senator from the state of Missouri, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Chuck Grassley, President pro tempore.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of Homeland Security, Peter Gaynor of Rhode Island to be Administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
It's been 10 days since the United States removed Iran's chief terrorist, Qasem Soleimani, from the battlefield. It's been 5 days since the brutal violence, recklessness, and failed governance that defines the Iranian regime was put on full display with their shoot-down of a Ukrainian civilian airliner and the deaths of all 176 souls on board. After a brief stab at a failed cover-up, the Iranian government had to come clean and explain that its own recklessness had killed more than 80 Iranians, 63 Canadians, and the other victims. And despite the claims of supposed experts on Iran that Iranians would rally behind their oppressive regime, the truth is quite different. Instead, thousands of Iranians have taken to the streets to celebrate Soleimani's death, condemn the regime's domestic repression, and call for a regime change in Tehran, and denounce their government's feeble efforts to lay its own violence at the feet of the United States. According to journalists, here is one chant that's been ringing out on the streets of Iran. Soleimani is a murderer, his leader a traitor. Here's another. They're lying that our enemy is America. Our enemy is right here. The irony is rich, Mr. President. As Iran's master terrorist, Soleimani himself led efforts to brutalize Iranian protesters who dared to challenge the regime. Just a few months ago, he boasted to Iraqi leaders, quote, "We in Iran know how to deal with protests." Well, that violent approach is exactly why Iraqis and Iranians alike are now celebrating his death and denouncing the regime that he helped lead. I'm sure the mullahs regret that Soleimani himself is no longer around to help intimidate and murder their own citizens into silence. These protests aren't limited to Iran either. Protesters are back in Iraq as well. Not phony Iran-staged demonstrations, but real citizens-led protests across Iraq. Iraqis are demanding a government whose top priority is Iraqis' own interests rather than facilitating Iranian interference. Now, given the death and terror that Iran has wrought in the Middle East for decades, this kind of reaction shouldn't be a surprise. But strangely, it seems it has surprised many of our fellow Americans. Here at home, many on the left and in the media have rushed to reflexively blame President Trump and not the Iranian regime for the recent violence. After only the earliest initial reports, the Speaker of the House rushed to blame our administration for, quote, needless provocations, she said. And following Iran's shoot-down of the airliner, one prominent House Democrat characterized the regime's violence as collateral damage resulting from America's actions, exactly how the Iranians themselves were trying to spin it. One Democrat running for president tried a similar embarrassing equivocation. He said the civilians that Iran had blown up were, quote, caught in the middle of an unnecessary and unwarranted military tit-for-tat. For several days, you could not open a newspaper or turn on the television without prominent Democrats and so-called foreign policy experts setting aside decades of Iranian aggression to imply or even say outright that America, not Iran, was responsible for the cycle of violence, that President Donald Trump was the real villain. So we are faced with a remarkable spectacle, Mr. President. Even under threat of tear gas or even gunfire, The brave people of Iran are themselves displaying more willingness to criticize their own brutal rulers than we saw in the initial responses from some Democrats and so-called experts right here at home. A remarkable spectacle, but a pretty sad one. I hope this can be a lesson to anyone who has let their domestic political grievances pollute their judgment of world affairs. It shouldn't take the brave Iranian people themselves to remind American leaders that Tehran has long been the force for bad in this situation, and the United States is a force for good. So, as I've said, the President's bold action has attracted significant political criticism from Democrats here in Congress. Now, it is the Senate's prerogative to weigh in on foreign policy, and I fully expect we will debate a war powers resolution from some of our colleagues very soon. I look forward to discussing the last administration's failed strategy that got us here. The Obama administration responded to Iran's violence and aggression with appeasement and retrenchment rather than pushback. I look forward to discussing the fact that senior military commanders did not just recommend the President take immediate action to disrupt Iranian plots against our personnel. They believed the U.S. would be culpably negligent if it didn't act to stop the plotting. Now, I expect some of the Democrats who have rhetorically embraced the intelligence community when it suited their political interests may now rush to criticize the career professionals. I look forward to hearing our colleagues who want to quibble over the word imminent explain just how close we should let the terrorists come to killing more Americans before we defend ourselves. Just how close should we let terrorists come to killing more Americans before we defend ourselves? I assure you, if the President had not acted to disrupt a deadly attack, I'm confident these same critics would have blasted him for failing to protect American lives. Just a few days before the strike, the junior senator from Connecticut was blasting the administration for rendering America impotent in the Middle East. He complained that no one fears us. No one listens to us, he said. But naturally, after President Trump did take bold action, the same colleague has become a fierce critic for supposedly being, President Trump for supposedly being too harsh. Not exactly a model of consistency. Our Democratic colleagues were very happy to give President Obama wide latitude to engage in strikes where American lives and American interests were far less directly at stake than with Mr. Soleimani. But now, the same Democrats who embraced the Obama intervention say Libya, for example, say it's a bridge too far for President Trump to respond with limited force to Iranian-directed strikes against American interests and personnel that have been escalating for months. Okay in Libya, not okay here. The double standards are literally head-spinning. So, I expect the Senate will soon debate Senator Kane's war powers resolution. For a year now, I've wanted the Senate to go on record about our military presence and strategy in Syria and Iraq. I'm glad my Democratic colleagues may finally be interested in having that discussion rather than ducking it. I don't believe the blunt instrument of the war powers resolution is an acceptable substitute for the studied oversight the Senate can exercise through hearings, resolutions, and more tailored legislation. So I'll strongly oppose the resolution. And I would urge all our colleagues to consider what message the Senate should send to Iran and the world at the very moment that America's actions are challenging the calculus in Tehran for the better. We appear to have restored a measure of deterrence in the Middle East. So let's not screw it up. Now, on another matter, on Friday, Speaker Pelosi signaled she may finally wind down her one-woman blockade of a fair and timely impeachment trial. It's certainly been revealing to see House Democrats first claim that impeachment was so urgent, that they could not even wait to fill out the factual record, and then subsequently delay it for weeks. Well, I'm glad the Speaker finally realized she never had any leverage in the first place to dictate Senate procedure to senators and is giving in to bipartisan pressure to move forward. In terms of influencing Senate proceedings, this strange gambit has achieved absolutely nothing. But it has produced one unintended side effect. The Speaker's efforts to pre-commit the Senate to carry on an investigation with which her own House lost patience concedes that the House case is rushed, weak, and incomplete. Let me say that again. By trying and failing to get the Senate to pre-commit to redoing the House's investigation, House Democrats admitted that even they do not believe their own case is persuasive. Think about the message it sends when the prosecutors are this desperate to get the judge and jury to redo their homework for them. And think about the separation of powers. The House knowingly declined to spend time on legal battles and due process that it would have needed to pursue certain avenues. But now, after declining to fight their own fight, they want the Senate to pre-commit ourselves to wage these potentially protracted legal battles on their behalf. They wanted senators to pre-commit ourselves to not only judge the case that House Democrats are actually going to send over, but also to reopen the investigatory stage and maybe supplement Chairman Schiff's slapdash work. In other words, the president's opponents are afraid of having the Senate judge the case they actually are going to send us. They're afraid of having the Senate judge the case they themselves voted on. That alone speaks volumes. A few weeks ago, in real time, many senators and legal experts tried to warn House Democrats that they were nowhere near a finished product. Nowhere near. That the articles of impeachment they had drafted were more like a censure resolution based on partisan anger than an actual impeachment based on careful investigation. The House ignored us at the time. They rushed ahead to meet a political timetable. But now they've spent almost a month conceding that their own case does not stand on its own and searching for ways to supplement it from the outside. This is exactly the kind of toxic new precedent that many of us warned about back in December. That Speaker Pelosi's House was not sending the Senate a thorough investigation. They were just tossing up a jump ball and hoping that the political winds might blow things their way. So here we are. The Senate was never going to pre-commit ourselves to redoing the prosecutor's homework for them, and we were never going to allow the Speaker of the House to dictate Senate proceedings to senators. House Democrats have already done enough damage to the precedent, to national unity, and to our institutions of government. The Senate will not be sucked into this precedent-breaking path. We will fulfill our constitutional duty. We will honor the reason for which the founders created this body, to ensure our institutions and our republic can rise above short-term factional fever. The House has done enough damage. The Senate is ready to fulfill our duty. I suggest that for quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it's now been 26 days since House Democrats voted to impeach the President of the United States. This is a predictable ending to an increasingly embarrassing impeachment inquiry. Apparently, Speaker Pelosi, Chairman Schiff, Chairman Nadler, and others were in such a big hurry to get this done before the end of the year, they've obviously gotten cold feet because they've refused to present the articles of impeachment to the Senate so we can have the trial. And as the presiding officer knows, ordinarily, if you are presented with a situation where the prosecution refuses to proceed to put on evidence in the case, they are dismissed. And it's a routine matter, dismissal for want of prosecution. Or if, in fact, they do intend to present the articles of impeachment, there is this fundamental notion of basic fairness included in the guarantee of a speedy trial that is obviously being neglected, avoided, and abused by the Speaker and her leaders in the House. Our Democratic colleagues in the House rushed through their investigation in only 12 weeks, and it ended up passing articles of impeachment on a partisan basis. After repeatedly saying this is a grave and urgent matter, it seems like Speaker Pelosi has experienced some buyer's remorse and questioned just how grave and urgent it really is. So here we are, as I said, 26 days later, and she still has not sent the articles of impeachment to the Senate. As we know, even though some have suggested the Senate could somehow proceed to trial absent the delivery of those articles here, we can't try the case until the charges are delivered. Well, finally, last Friday, the Speaker indicated that she will transmit the articles this week. They'll also have to name impeachment managers, representatives from the House that will come over and actually present the charges to the Senate and attempt to produce evidence in support of those charges. But it remains to be seen whether the Speaker will deliver the articles this week. She's been withholding them, as I said, for nearly 4 weeks now, claiming it's part of her strategy to get leverage over the Senate, a strategy that has yielded no positive results. In fact, what we've seen is the Speaker has zero leverage in the Senate. She runs the House, there's no doubt about that, but the Senate is a separate body, and we don't take our instructions from the House, just like the House does not take their direction from the Senate. Before the House even voted on the articles, Leader McConnell said the Senate should follow the same bipartisan framework used to guide the Clinton impeachment trial. I say bipartisan because at that time 100 senators agreed to this path forward. And the logic goes this way: if it was good enough for President Clinton, then it should be good enough for President Trump. Suffice it to say that the Speaker disagrees. Instead of sending the articles of impeachment over and letting 100 members of the Senate decide how best to proceed, she chose to take matters into her own hands. Apparently, the sole power of impeachment, as the Constitution describes the House's role, isn't good enough for Speaker Pelosi. She's now trying to assume what the Constitution says is the Senate's sole power to try all impeachments. But we shouldn't be fooled. The Spider claims this is not an effort to create a fair process. A fair process would be like the Bill Clinton impeachment trial, which was agreed to by 100 senators on a bipartisan basis. Our Democratic colleagues in the House threw fairness out the window months ago. This is Speaker Pelosi single-handedly ignoring the express commands of the Constitution for her own perceived political benefit. Now, Republicans aren't the only ones who think the Speaker has gone too far. There's bipartisan agreement that Speaker Pelosi should send the articles of impeachment over here forthwith. A number of our Senate Democrats have expressed their desire to get started with the impeachment trial. I think the senior senator from California, our friend Senator Feinstein, same state as the Speaker of the House, she summed it up best when she said, the longer it goes on, the less urgent it becomes. So if it's serious and urgent, send them over. If it isn't, don't send them over. Irrefutable logic. Now we're hearing from a growing number of House Democrats who have split from Speaker Pelosi and say it's time to send the articles. For example, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee said, we control the House, Mitch McConnell controls it in the Senate. Senator McConnell might disagree with that, but that's what the chairman of the Armed Services Committee said. He conceded, I think it's time to send the impeachment to the Senate. Well, with Speaker Pelosi facing increased backlash from members of her own party, including her rank-and-file Democrats, you can't help but wonder who is winning this game that she's playing, because it's clearly a game. It's laughable to say that she's doing this for the sake of the American people or the Constitution. A new poll released by The Hill and Harris last week showed that 58% of voters nationwide think it's high time for the House to send the articles of impeachment to the Senate. 58%. This delay isn't putting President Trump in a bad position. In fact, it's further proving the partisan motivations that have been driving the House impeachment inquiry from the very beginning. Speaker Pelosi obviously isn't doing this for the good of House Democrats. Their role in the impeachment inquiry is finished. And as I mentioned, a number of her own members think she's making a big mistake by holding up the articles. And this clearly isn't giving our Senate Democrat colleagues a leg up. Several of our colleagues here in the Senate have voiced their desire to get this thing going, as one has said. In fact, I think it's actually harming our Senate Democrat colleagues who are on the presidential campaign trail. Can you think what Senator Warren, Senator Sanders, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Bennett, and Senator Booker until this morning, who were all vying for the chance to be president, what they're thinking about the desirability of sitting here in the Senate chamber for 6 days a week while the Iowa caucuses are coming up on February the 3rd, the New Hampshire primary, South Carolina, Nevada, among others. The Iowa caucuses are happening just 3 weeks from today, and New Hampshire's primary is the week after that. These senators on the Democratic side who are running for the Democratic nomination, their campaigns are in high gear. And I imagine the last place they want to be is in Washington, D.C., sitting in this chamber during an impeachment trial. During the trial, every member of the Senate will be sitting in our desks 6 days a week until we're finished. And no, we won't have our electronic devices. I just saw a piece of cabinetry in the cloakroom where we'll be required to turn over our iPads and our iPhones. So this will just be us, not speaking. We don't have a speaking role, we have a listening role, sitting here for hours each afternoon, 6 days a week until we finish this process. Well, that doesn't leave a lot of time for our Senate colleagues who are running for the Democratic nomination to talk to voters in Iowa or New Hampshire. The longer Speaker Pelosi holds on to the articles of impeachment, the closer a trial gets to overlapping with those key dates. Now, you have to imagine our friends on the other side who are running for president are getting a little nervous. Cory Booker, who left the campaign trail this morning, recently said this trial could be a big, big blow to his campaign. Even a short 2-week trial could mean literally dozens of events we won't be able to go to. Now, while that is no longer true for Senator Booker, it is for the remaining candidates. Senator Warren shared this same sentiment, and she thinks being in Washington would prevent her from being able to build critical personal connections on the campaign trail. Had Speaker Pelosi immediately transmitted the articles of impeachment at the end of last year, it would have been the first item on the Senate's agenda when we reconvened in January. We could have used the Clinton model to guide the process, the same process the leader has promised since before the articles even passed. And I can't help but imagine the Senate and the American people would be close to putting this entire saga behind us. But instead, the Speaker sat on the articles. She stood in the way of the Senate's duty to try the impeachment trial, and she stood in the way of President Trump's due process rights. And the only people who seem to gain anything from this are the Democrats who are running for president but who are not United States senators, and thus aren't going to be tied up during the impeachment trial. Oddly enough, one of these candidates and his son are looming figures in the impeachment inquiry. If you're Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, or any other candidate who isn't a member of the Senate, you've got to be glad that the Speaker sat on these articles for nearly 4 weeks. Having your competitors stuck in Washington, literally in their seat, while you're hitting the campaign trail, well, that seems like a pretty good advantage to me. The timeline that the Speaker created is all but sure to interfere with the Iowa caucuses. It's remarkable that Democrats' effort to impeach a president of the opposing party could end up having a negative impact on the presidential candidates in their own. All of this is to say, Mr. President, it's time to bring this embarrassing chapter to an end. Republicans and Democrats and the American people all agree that it's time to get the articles of impeachment to the Senate so we can try the case according to our duties under the Constitution, and the American people and the Congress can move on. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I would note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.